Our first story begins in the North African country Tunisia, where authorities have intensified an operation to intercept migrants who are planning to reach Europe by crossing the Mediterranean Sea. The Tunisian National Guard says it has arrested smugglers and stopped more than 2,000 people in its coastal cities. Most have been held back in the city of Sfax. Tunisia has become a key launching pad, and the crackdown comes after a record number of crossings to Europe. I've just returned from a reporting trip in Italy where the migrants are arriving. I spoke to some of them and saw for myself what the situation on the ground has been. I will be talking to a migration policy expert after this report that I filed from Lampedusa. Hello from the Italian island of Lampedusa. We're in the middle of the Mediterranean, and North Africa is just 300 kilometers away. And that is the reason why this is the first entry point for many migrants seeking to reach Europe. In fact, that monument over there is called the door to Europe. While migrants frequently pass through Lampedusa, authorities here were forced to declare a state of emergency when thousands of people arrived on the island in just 24 hours. The migrants are coming from Tunisia, and they're arriving in small boats like the ones you see behind me, made out of iron. And if you look over there, you'll see a group of people that have just landed on the island. Some of the migrants that I've spoken to have told me that they've spent up to 2 days at sea, and they've paid between 500 and 800 euros for the trip. Italian authorities believe the reason for the influx is that bad weather conditions. The seas were rough, and that had created a backlog in Tunisia. And as soon as the weather improved, smugglers sent boats out into the sea by the hundreds. This behind me is the only migrant reception center on the island. It is built to accommodate 400 people, but at the peak of the arrivals, there were about 7,000 people behind this fence. Most of the migrants are from sub-Saharan African countries. I've met people from Nigeria, Sierra Leone, the Gambia, Guinea, Ivory Coast, Cameroon. They're mostly young men, but there are some women and children too.
You spend more than 3 days in the water. It's terrible. I wish I can live here today and go to a better place because I've suffered a lot in this journey.
We are here to support our family. We are here to work. We are not here for joke. We want to make our family proud. We want to make everything easier for them. For feeding, education, our younger sisters are there, our younger brothers are there. Things are hard for them.
While there are some refugees, most of the people who've arrived here are coming from countries that are considered safe, so they don't qualify for asylum. European governments want to make sure that those who aren't going to get asylum are sent back to the countries that they've come from as soon as possible. At least that is what the chief of the European Union said when she visited here.
Those who cannot qualify for asylum cannot stay in the European Union. We will reach out to the countries of origin to facilitate this process. We will decide who comes to the European Union and under what circumstances. We must step up our efforts to fight the smugglers. We have to join forces with the countries of origin and the countries of transit to crack down on this brutal business.
But that brutal business is thriving on demand. Poverty and insecurity are on the rise in many parts of Africa, robbing people of prospects and leading them to seek security and greener pastures in Europe. And I'm now joined by Otilia Monganidze from the Institute of Security Studies. She is a lawyer and analyst. Her portfolio covers international human rights law as well as migration trends and policy. Welcome to DW News Africa, Otilia. We're seeing more and more people leave Africa to reach Europe by crossing the Mediterranean. You monitor migration trends on the continent. What have you observed about the volumes in which people are leaving and the factors that are pushing them to do so?
Now, just as Europe is finishing its summer season into autumn, we are seeing an increase in the number of people that are attempting to cross from Africa to Europe irregularly. There's a number of reasons why people are on the move, most of them coming from countries out of West Africa, across the Sahel into the Horn. And the primary motivators really, or the things that are pushing them out, include conflict, climate impacts, or challenges in terms of governance, but moving towards Europe in the hope, perhaps, to get a better life. But one of the main reasons that we find more and more people opting for irregular channels is that the regular or legal channels to get to Europe are increasingly restrictive. So more and more people still wanting to move to Europe find themselves opting for very dangerous routes, as we have seen in recent days, but I'm sure as we'll continue to see throughout parts of autumn.
Right, and I do want to pick up on that point in a short moment, but I want to begin by asking you about Europe's strategy, which appears to be centered on stopping the flow of people, and that involves agreements with countries like Tunisia, where we will see the European Union pay hundreds of millions of euros to Tunisia in exchange for the Tunisian government holding people back in Tunisia. You have been critical of that agreement in particular. Can you tell us why?
First, it's a costly strategy, and it's not a new strategy. So which countries are now being involved, for example, on the African continent, the recent deal with Tunisia, that may be part of the difference. But this is a strategy, rather, that the European Union has been trying to get results from since, at the very least, 2014. So it's over 9 years of a strategy to push back irregular migration. But what we know is that this has not actually reduced the numbers, but it has only made people take more dangerous routes.
Otile, I was recently in Lampedusa, and some of the migrants that I met told me that it's almost impossible to get a visa to come to Europe. To the point that you were making, can Europe, or perhaps how can Europe do better in the way of offering more legal pathways for people to migrate? This is inevitable. People want to move.
And I think you've hit the nail right on the head, that people not only want to move, but that people will move regardless of the restrictions. The question is which pathways they will use based on what is available. At the moment, not only is it a financial cost, but it's the scope of the requirements to get a visa, and I'm not talking just about a visitor's visa into Europe, but perhaps also work, to study, to stay, is extremely, extremely high. This is not to say that people that are crossing irregularly are not spending hundreds of dollars in order to do so, but then they have the assurance, so to speak, that they may reach the shores of Europe. Whereas through the visa process, using the Tunisia deal as an example, one of the trade-offs, so to speak, was to allocate just over 1,000 visas annually to Tunisians. But what we know is in a year, out of North Africa, Tunisia has the highest number of people that seek to migrate towards Europe, sitting at about 40,000 applicants. So 1,300 visas being provided, where over 40,000 want to move, mean that the remaining 39,000 or so people will look to other channels. And unfortunately, that channel, as we've seen, not only those that actually make it across, but the many people that have lost their lives on that journey, that people will still want to move. At what cost? Right now, it's at human cost, not just at financial cost.
Otile, when you listen to some governments in Europe, they say that the migration flows from Africa are a challenge. They refer to this as a crisis. In fact, some officials in the government in Italy called the recent arrivals on the island of Lampedusa war on Europe. That kind of language, is it exaggerated considering the actual numbers of migration from Africa to Europe and the fact that, for the most part, migrants in Africa are more likely to migrate within the continent than they are to leave the continent?
So over 80% of people from Africa migrate within the African continent, choosing countries that are closest to them, so neighboring countries. The remaining percentage go elsewhere in the world, of which Europe is only one of those destinations. So when I hear some of the rhetoric that seems to suggest whether it's language around waves of movement or war on Europe, a lot of it is tinged with the fact that these are people coming from Africa. There are more people that are moving from Eastern Europe, for example, towards Europe than out of the African continent. There are increasingly more people that are coming out of the Middle East and further in Asia towards Europe than Africa. And so the question is, why is it only a crisis when it's Africans moving? And we've touched on some of the reasons. Part of it is, of course, the barriers to entry legally that put it in that way. The second is perhaps a lack of introspection on the part of Europe that is part of the current deals that are being negotiated, but not at the level that it could be, which is that Europe is an aging continent in need, incidentally, of a lot of workers, whether it's on farms or whether it's in other industries, and is simply not growing at the rate that would allow for it to have that labor force. So perhaps what needs to be happening is a pragmatic conversation between Europe and Africa that looks at what are the needs of both continents, but also an honest reflection that looks at what are the drivers pushing people out, that requires accountability also on the African end, but also on Europe's side as well, that actually reaches a better agreement. Like I said, putting hundreds of millions or even billions of euro and throwing it at what is perceived as the problem and not addressing some of the key drivers as to why people are moving. In 2, 3, maybe even 10 years' time, we will be having the same conversation about this issue. But if it's not addressed properly, it may then be the crisis, and a crisis that is irreversible.
Otilia Monganidze from the Institute of Security Studies, we really appreciate your insights on the program today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.